Hello, today I'm going to discuss two questions. And I don't know if this is really going to be an informal talk because I'm not an expert on the one question. I do have a pretty good knowledge of the other question from an historical standpoint. But so we're not going to call this anything other than an informal talk. We're just friends sitting around discussing. I'm going to discuss its, perhaps you might say, a conjunction, a disjunction, or just two. I wouldn't know really how to relate these two subjects, but we're going to explore them. One I don't know a whole lot about, and that is the problem of free will in philosophy. The other I do know a fair bit about, and that would be the evolution in political philosophy of the concept of political freedom or the concept of democracy, republicanism, whatever terms we want to apply. Let's say 18th century liberal theory, 19th century liberal theory, 20th century democratic theory, which would be an outgrowth of some merger of 18th century liberal theory and maybe 19th century concepts of social equality. Okay, those two fed together, fused to form the modern democratic state. And I'm going to discuss a kind of paradox that, from my layman's knowledge, and I will emphasize that, from my layman's knowledge, the question, a paradox emerges when we put together philosophies that believe in free will and philosophies that don't, with certain political philosophies that tend to pair with those philosophies, and you notice a strange pattern. Okay, before we get into it, I want to just very briefly solicit those who are philosophy buffs and mathematicians, and please either be something of an expert in your field or very, very knowledgeable. A lot of you have been sending me interesting stuff on metaphysics, and that's great. I appreciate it. I consider all perspectives, but I'm homing for particular fields of expertise. One would be I made some videos that I've pulled on the null set, and very frankly, they were not good. They were chock filled with errors, and they were unprofessional, and I apologize for that. I don't think the question of the null set is central to my earlier arguments on CH. I mean, that's my own. I don't want to rehash that, but I don't believe that people were pulling the axiom of infinity out of a hat to try to pwn me on that question, and they never explained how it did. And so, but you know, I want to be able to make an argument on the null set that's a good argument. And philosophically, it's a very difficult concept to understand, just because our Western minds don't understand it too well. But anyhow, so PM me on that, and I appreciate hearing it. The other would be on the philosophy of time. Now, I have just a second. I have this. Okay, so Reichenbach. And I also have geometry and relativity in the fourth dimension. So stuff on the science of space-time and the mathematics of space-time I have. And I would enjoy that, but particularly I'm interested in questions like presentism, eternalism, and the different philosophies of time that have arisen primarily within the Western tradition itself. I know that we've discussed circular time and philosophies of time, but I'm, more interested in, again, a very narrow range of focus. So, by all means, PM me, and I'd love to dialogue on that. Okay, to the subject. Free will is a problem in philosophy that I don't claim any expertise on, but what I do know is that there are philosophies that have tended to believe in free will, and philosophies that have tended to downplay the concept that there is a will that acts freely. Now, philosophies that have tended to believe in the concept of free will, and often this is a split within religions. Okay, within Christianity, Roman Catholicism has staunchly defended the idea of free will. Now, they will agree with the Calvinist branch of Christianity that yes, there's original sin, which, that loses me right there, okay, but that whole original sin thing, because, if we're emanations of the absolute, then that's what we are. Now, we might forget that in ignorance, but And that could be what they mean by original sin, but I don't personally believe the idea that we've lost that nature forever. But that's neither here nor there. Catholicism, it tends to at least accept the idea that there's free will, which, is closer to my perspective than, let's say, Calvinism on the other end of the spectrum, which denies it completely. And then within scientific philosophies, you will generally have a deterministic bias, but then you'll have some who maybe have some quantum consciousness theories and some idea that life is a quantum phenomenon. Penrose seems to veer in that direction. And then you also have Stoicism, and in the East you have Taoism, and they tend towards not a mechanistic kind of determinism, but more of a maybe an organic kind of determinism. Not a determinism, but kind of a feeling that things flow. So it's very much not deterministic in the Western mechanistic sense, but the idea that things flow and they have a nature. Now, I'm not an expert on either of those philosophies. And to be very clear, within Taoism, there's a split. I think at least the Western mind would perceive a split between its more philosophical branches and then more of the Bon tradition, okay, or the kind of shamanistic traditions. Again, not an expert there. But I look at a divide of which philosophies tend to believe in free will, and I've overgeneralized. I've radically overgeneralized because I'm not an expert. But then which philosophies I know for sure either don't believe in it or downplay it, and I know it's something interesting. Those philosophies that tend to not emphasize free will so much tend to politically be rather liberal. Deism tended to downplay that there were factions of deism that believed in free will, English deism, and that tended to be very conservative and support the monarchy. French deism tended to be, which didn't believe in free will, tended to support political freedom and supported republicanism. Calvinism tended to be more liberal on questions of political participation, even though Calvin himself was a dictator. Over time, the Calvinists tended to support the English Revolution, the American Revolution, and I think in the beginning, the French Revolution. And even when it became more radical, there were still some Calvinists in the United States who went along with it. Even when it turned against religion, they would say, well, that's because it's Roman Catholicism. Okay, that was their vantage point on that. In the East, Taoism tends to favor more of a free-flowing way, more of a libertarian view of human nature. If I wanted to hazard a guess, as again, not someone who's an expert on Chinese history, I would say that Taoism would correspond, that Lao Tzu would correspond to Jefferson, and Confucius maybe would correspond to Adams or Hamilton. Okay, if you want to have a very crude kind of parallel with modern American history. So the question that arises is, how is it that free will and political freedom, which you would think that people who believe in free will would believe in political freedom, and people who don't believe in free will would favor slavery, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, free will tends to put the onus of responsibility on the individual. It tends to deny underlying social causes. If you commit a crime, even a nonviolent crime, it's your fault, it wasn't poverty. And, people who tend to believe in that often tend to be reactionaries. Now, I personally believe that there's free will, and I believe that there is responsibility, but my own philosophy is that you have to consider free will, but you have to consider other factors too. And I don't have, again, on the original question of the seeming paradox between philosophies that tend to support free will, but then take reactionary positions on positions of politics, and then the reverse, philosophies that tend to take liberal positions on politics, but that deny free will. I don't know that there's an easy answer to that as a paradox. I would suggest maybe that at the time of the Enlightenment, when the human will tended to be the concept of, let's maybe go to part 2 here. Hold on.